So I think we have some stuff to talk about.
I'm sure we do.
I think that we can just start off by saying, what drew you to Chicago and what drew you to the site?
Well, we owned property in and around Chicago for a long time. We had actually renovated an old loft building as well a few years before in partnership with Jerry and Jordan Carlick. And Jerry called me one day and said that he had found this interesting building on Michigan Avenue. He thought it was interesting because it had it's a small office building, but had a lot of air rights that would be important for the site next door. And I said it sounded interesting, but it was a little too expensive for my sense. And he said, well, the air rights could be worth more. So I said, well, look, I don't want to speculate that somebody's going to buy the site next door and want them one day, but why don't you find out whether the site next door is available? And then we'll take a look. And sure enough, it was. It had been a failed condo project at one point. And it was REO with a bank in Chicago. And so I came out here. I mean, I know Chicago is used to being cold, but let me tell you, that was one of the cold experiences of my life. But I went to the site and thought, well, this is worth something. And you know, for people, I'm from New York, and although I've been here many times, you know, I don't know the city like I would if I had grown up here. But I knew the Chicago Art Institute, and that was 2 or 3 blocks away. And of course, Michigan Avenue is legendary. So all of that made me very, very interested. And that's where when we decided to move ahead.
You're a prolific art collector, which we can talk about later, and a lot of your personal art actually adorns the building. But so you like the site, it's on Michigan Avenue. What's your next steps then? We had worked together previously on a 64-story condo building in New York called 50 West. But it wasn't just a straight call that you gave us.
No, and so when we decided to move ahead with the project, we made an agreement with the bank that we would buy the site, but subject to getting it fully entitled. So, of course, we needed a good architectural firm to help us with the design concept and ultimately with the entitlements. And so Helmut came immediately to mind because we worked closely with Helmut and Philip on 50 West Street in New York. But both personally and from a practical point of view, because Jerry and Jordan were partners with me in this, and they had yet another partner, and everybody had their opinion about architects who would be appropriate. Plus, I have found that when you do a competition for a property, for an architectural assignment, bringing together a lot of highly talented people to present their own view informs you in a different way than if you just went to one great architect and said, okay, tell me what you can do with it, and they show you their various ideas. anyway, so we decided to have a competition, which didn't make your dad happy. He said, Francis, for God's sakes, we built 50 West and we went through all that together and you're going to make me do another competition. I said, Helmut, it's just the way it is. So he accepted that. And as you know, in addition to being an excellent sailing racer, competitor, he's very competitive in everything that he does. And he's a fierce competitor in competitions. And many architects will look at a site and then 6 weeks later or something, 2 months later, they'll come and present their ideas. And that's kind of it. And I think there were 5 or 6 firms competing. But Helmut had this habit of following up. So every week or two, he'd be in my office. And I said, Helmut, aren't you in Chicago? And he'd come and he'd present different ideas. And he said, well, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? All these models. And through this process, he not only developed a lot of different ideas, but he also sort of, I guess, got a good sense of what we might be looking for and what our criteria was. And so when it was all over, we had a little committee of our stakeholders, and we all took a look, and we were convinced that Helmut had produced the best ideas, and so we signed on with the firm, and very happy that we did that. And,
I don't think many people have probably seen the original concept for the building, which was different than it turned out today, and we can talk about that along further in this conversation about what changed in the building. But initially, that building was more rectangular and actually was stepped invertedly by growing as it got higher. And then I think, like you said, there was this constant evolution of designs.
well, what happened was, and I'll take partial responsibility for this, or total responsibility. So this design had a series of sort of offsetting boxes as the building got higher. And that was the final design of Helmut's, which there were a lot that we chose from. And he had a conference room. Helmut's gold conference room was almost as big as this room. And the walls were covered with sketches, and there were 20 models on the table, whatever. And we settled on this one, and it went through a preliminary review, and all the different people in Chicago government bought into it. I think even the Chicago Trib architectural critic liked it. And we were sort of on our way, and then I was on vacation with a couple of my daughters. My daughter, and she's a surfer, and with a couple of her surfing friends. And one of them looked at this thing and said, I said, what do you think of this? Proudly, And she says, she was, I don't know how old she was, a teenager. She says, well, it looks like the building's going to fall over. And I said, wait a minute. And I thought about it. I said, she's right. And I said, who's going to buy an apartment in a building that looks like it's going to fall over? So I called your dad on no less than New Year's Day. And I said, Helmut, I think we have a problem. And he said, what's the problem? And I said, well, I'm not sure about the design. He said, you're not sure about the design? Everybody in the city loves it. What are you talking about?
That sounds, like somebody defending their design, yeah.
But he also, Helmut and Philip, working completely closely with him, had this attitude that you could always do things better. So after your dad sort of got through thinking the worst of me and telling me what those thoughts were, he then said, well, okay, we'll buckle down and we'll try to improve the design. And in the end, it changed radically. and we went to a whole different concept, which when it was all done, even Helmut, I think, I'm sure, was convinced that it was a great design, and he was very happy with it, as was Philip, and as was I and everybody involved. So it was a awkward transition, but we got there.
As often happens, right? That there's always this evolution of design, and that I think something that my father and the firm has always adhered to is that you can always improve on the work. And you're right, the end result was something that was radically different. It has these soft curves, actually similar to the building in New York with 50 West. But, you know, we have this juxtaposition between the rectilinear base and then the curved tower. And that was obviously to respond to some of the context of the site.
Well, it was complicated because, the site is a little bit odd, but it's basically rectangular. But we...
well, it's also along the Michigan Avenue historic corridor.
Well, that was another big problem, which the Jahn office found a solution to. We're in a historic district. And so when we went to the city and proposed it, they said, well, you know, it's an historic district. And they said, well, we would consider moving the historic district because the buildings south of ours were not historically significant, and then our site was an empty lot, so they would consider moving it one block. But they were very concerned with the datum or the way in which the street wall was constructed. And Helmut and Philip came up with a way to sort of respect that street wall, but at the same time, and there's an element in it that's kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but it's a fake facade that creates that continuous street wall sense that they wanted. So we responded to the city planner's concerns. Your firm did well, and the city was convinced, and then they adjusted the historic district to accommodate our building, and they also accommodated the height of the building, which was greater than what would normally have been permitted there.
Yeah, I think that's a fun little story to tell too, that originally it was proposed as a 1,000-foot tall building, 1,000 feet at 1,000 Michigan. And then when it was condo, I think we had it at 834 feet.
I think 32, but I'm not sure.
And then we can talk about, actually, this is a good segue to the shift over to to apartments from condos.
Well, on the question of the height, Philip tells a funny story. At some point, I think he or Helmut or somebody was talking with the city, or maybe it was Philip, I can't remember. And, you know, he said to them, well, how did you decide on 832 feet? You know, there's some logic. And they said, what don't you understand about 832 feet? That was the end of the discussion, and it meant don't bring it up again, which was still considerably more than the allowed footage. Yeah, and then, you know, originally we conceived of it as a condominium building, and had, I think, 420 apartments in it. And
I guess it's also, I think, good to set like a timeline here, is that what started in, I think, July of 2015, and now we kind of fast forward and we're in, I think, July of 2020.
We're in July, well, April of 20, or May of 2020, which you may recall there was that little problem that we all had.
And the building had broken ground in December of 2019.
We had started the foundation, and we had put the foundation in. And it was sort of at the penultimate moment where we had to commit to the crane and going vertical. And COVID was happening. None of us knew what that meant, but we were living it. And one of the things that they started generating were these special regulations that if you were continuing construction during COVID, workmen had to be separated by a certain amount of feet, and there were all of these complicated protocols. And of course, the financial institutions were not in a good mood. And although we had arranged for financing, it was a two-phase thing where we had gotten a certain amount of money to complete the foundation, and then we would get another commitment that had to be confirmed to build the rest of it. And the lender they weren't saying no, but they were acting concerned. And so I read all these tea leaves, and the idea of pouring that slab.
The mat?
With all the workers having to be, I don't know how many feet apart. And it just seemed crazy. So I said, you know what, we're going to pause now. At the same time, we had been selling apartments, and we'd sold about 100 apartments, so quite a number. But the building's pricing was lower in the bottom and higher on top. And we were selling all the lower apartments. So the average price of what we sold was just a little more than breaking, but our real profit margins were in the top, and we weren't selling the buildings. The apartments on top, people weren't buying because it was more expensive. So that concerned me as well. And so all of these things, so we went into hibernation for a period of time. And meanwhile, Rob Singer, my director of development, is having conversations with people here in the market, and they were telling him that this market was unbelievably strong for super luxury apartments, and that new rent levels were being achieved that previously had not been thought of. And they were suggesting that we think about going rental. And so while we were hibernating, Rob was hatching that plan and eventually worked with your firm. And we redid the layouts. And, if you're not an architect, you think, okay, well, you just erase a few lines here and you put a few more lines in, and that should be easy. It doesn't work that way.
Especially when every floor plate is different, because this building gets bigger as it goes up.
Every floor plate is different. Plus, when you go from 420 apartments to 738, I think, the plumbing stack is different. Everything, the mechanical.
More elevators.
We took $6 million of plans and we put them in the garbage. And the Jahn firm started again. And we came up with the new plans for the building that you see is built in, and we're happy to say fully occupied today.
Yeah, I think it's also, you start to touch on it, but the challenge of anticipating what the market wanted and what you were going to do, but then also through this incredibly challenging period of instilling confidence in your investors and your lenders. And I guess, what role do you feel that your vision and that the design played in helping to assure them that this was the path forward?
Well, development is a very complex process, and we view it as gathering stakeholders' interests and trying to get them aligned. So first you have to start with the community. And just because you have some idea for some site doesn't mean that the community shares it. And we feel if you go against the community, you're asking for trouble, and most likely they're not going to let you anyway. But even if you were somehow able to get by, that's not a good idea. So it's very important for us to partner with the community, to partner with government, because they have to approve it, and to partner with our banks and investors, because you have to have the resources or you can't realize it. So everybody has to share the vision. And everybody, especially, well, I don't know that everybody, but more experienced people in the real estate business, and everybody, all the other stakeholders, want great design. You know, who wants some crappy building in their community, or who wants some crappy building that you finance? Life's too short. So having this wonderful design, and of course, the Jahn firm had an exceptional reputation in Chicago, which gave people confidence to agree to things that might not normally. So all that came together. And when the bankers and the investors see that kind of cohesion, it gives them confidence. And so all of that is what came together to make the building possible.
And I guess it's also salient to talk about another adversity moment with the project, when the untimely and unexpected death of my father, and how that impacted what the trajectory of the project was.
Well, you know, of course, it was an incredibly shocking moment. Helmut, even though he was in his early 80s, but he was very vital, still racing his boat, riding his bicycle everywhere. To meet this sort of untimely death was a great shock. But even though we had a very close relationship with your father, we had an equally close relationship with Philip. And he had been totally integrated in the process, and Helmut and he had their way of partnering, which I don't know, I don't know how long they had worked together. Decades.
40 years.
40 years. And by the time your father unfortunately died, the part of a lot of the planning that he was most impactful in had already taken place. And a lot of the other work were not picked up, but were things that Philip and the other associates at Jahn who worked on the project could carry forward and did. So I cared for your father a lot, but from a practical point of view, the Jahn team was so efficient and so well tuned that there would, at least on our side, there was no visible interruption.
Well, thanks for that compliment. I think that, you know, that's obviously, there's a huge story here over the 9 years that took to complete this project. I think that probably not enough is said about let's call it the financing mechanics that you had to employ to to make this project successful as well.
Yeah, well, as every developer knows, you can't execute any idea regardless of how everybody else feels about it without resources. And early in my real estate career, when I was scrambling for money, some wise man said, "You've got to go to the banks. They have all the money." And at that point in my career, I didn't really know any bankers. And long ago, I figured out that they do have most of the money, and that they're an essential part of what we do. And banks, we think of it as a place we deposit money or we borrow money, but they're really capital allocators. They decide where to put the resources that they're entrusted with. And they're on the line every day. They've got more people breathing down their necks than I do. And so we always try to work very closely with our lenders. And the bank that was most, had committed to this project and was financing it when COVID came along was Goldman Sachs. And originally, when they called me, usually a loan, we needed $300 million in a bank loan. It's divided. Most U.S. banks don't want to take that kind of exposure, or almost none. And usually a loan of that size will have several banks participating, and especially for condominium projects. In those days, the largest exposure that even the big banks wanted to take to a condominium project was 50 or 75 million, which meant that you would normally have 4 to 6 banks involved, which we did, incidentally, was 50 Western. Goldman calls me up, and the person who was my lender there, I often say banks tend to come and go, but lenders stick around forever, and you know them one place and they show up somewhere else. So the guy at Goldman, who was my lender, I had been my banker at Citibank in the 90s. Anyway, he calls up and he says, we want to do this with you. And so I said, well, how much are you going to commit? Because normally they say, okay, we'll lead the part, banking participation. We'll put up $100 million and we go find participants for $200 million. He said, well, we're going to put up all the money. We're going to be a single source provider.
Were you shocked?
I was shocked. I said, are you sure? I said, that's the way we like to do things here, Goldman. And their terms were very reasonable, et cetera, et cetera. And, but by the time COVID came along, they changed their tune. And the wise men at Goldman said, well, we only want to put up $200 million. You'll have to find another $100 million somewhere else. So that wasn't that easy. And particularly post-COVID.
So what did you do? Did you call in some favors? Did you?
Well, actually what happened was, so the lender at Goldman, who I knew originally at Citibank, Rod Colburn, was from Colorado, and he was an unusual guy, and he was more sort of a Colorado type than he was a Goldman type. But anyway, one of his colleagues at Citibank, when he worked on my account, was now at Deutsche Bank. So he calls him up, and he says, look, we got this thing we're doing with Francis. You remember him? He said, oh, yeah. So yeah, we like Francis. And Deutsche said, okay, we'll put up the other 100. So that's how that piece came together. And there was another problem, however. Normally, when you do projects of this size, there's what we call the pref equity. So equity gets divided into 2 parts. There's senior equity and junior equity. The junior equity we were putting up, but the senior equity you have to find in the investment marketplace. And often it comes from hedge funds, particularly on large projects. So for instance, our partners on 50 West Street was a well-known hedge fund, one of the largest in the United States. But these guys want a lot of money, want very high, they charge a lot for the money that they're willing to put up. And, you know, development, particularly rental development, you know, it's not some get-rich-quick scheme. Normally, these projects are built into returns of between 6 and 7%. So, you know, half the time you wonder why you're doing this. You just want to buy a CD and go to sleep. And, but the idea of paying the hedge fund returns, which are mid-teens at the least, it just was a misfit. So I was trying to figure out what to do about this. And I came up with an approach that has not been used before, and which was to tie certain tax benefits in with the with this senior equity, and we created a unique structure which we used. So we were able to find investors who were tax oriented, in addition to but because they were getting a big tax break as a result, they were willing to take a more reasonable return, which made the financing affordable and made the whole thing work. Particularly when we went into the rental mode, because condominiums, you know, you can hope you're going to have a more substantial profit margin, so you might be able to afford these higher returns.
An amazing job by you, your team, Rob and Jordan and Jerry. I think you've taken this experience and obviously your previous experience with us at 50 West and other projects, and you've compiled them into this new book that you wrote.
Yeah, so I have a pretty eclectic background and do a lot of different things. But early in life, my father was in the publishing business, so I know about publishing. And along the way, I wrote a couple of books. And so I woke up one day, and when we were getting started on this one, I thought, well, maybe I would write. I had an idea for another book. And one of the things that I understood, well, I sort of understood it before, but became crystal clear when we built 50 West Street, is, you know, these buildings, even though in people's minds they just sort of pop up out of nowhere, there are hundreds, maybe pushing 1,000 people, professionals of all kinds, design professionals, tradesmen, all the different trades, the government people, the city planners, everybody. Such a huge, really, village that comes together to make one of these things happen. So I thought it would be interesting to document that process. And so I called my friend and co-writer, Rebecca Paley, who's sitting out there somewhere, and said, hey, you want to do another one? Because she had done my prior book, which was a memoir called Risk Game. And I said, I got an idea. I got a title for a new book. It's called Autobiography of a Skyscraper. And the intent was not to tell so much my story of developing this building, but to tell all of the people who impacted the story. So that's the book that we did. And during the process, Rebecca interviewed all of the people who worked on it. I mean, not all of them, but all of the major tradespeople, certainly the architects, interior designers, engineers, city planners, the whole gamut. And so the whole development process is documented in that book, which will be published September 15th.
I think it's up.
You'll get a free copy, Evan, but
thank you.
Others can order it online or do whatever they do.
I think I have a book for you too.
I'm sorry?
I have a book or two for you too.
Okay,
But,
well, I like your books.
well, that's incredible. And I think it's a great perspective that you give credit to the, just trove of people that come together to create these projects. And I think we could go on talking for still a little bit more, but I think we want to give time to the other sessions and panelists. So thanks for sharing some of the insight and your experience.
Thank you, Evan, for this conversation, and hope it was of interest to you folks.